Hi, and welcome to another installment of Anti-Politica, a channel that doesn't produce content on a regular basis. We turn on this little camera only when we feel that we can offer a novel, interesting perspective and food for thought that cannot be easily found on the internet. It is time for us to do a follow-up to our previous analysis of the Middle East and what's been going on there. In light of the fact that we have a new administration. President Trump has been in office for almost a month now. His appointments are going through to our great satisfaction. So let's revisit the Middle East, Israel, Gaza, and all those questions and theorize together about what we can expect moving forward. In order to lay out our arguments in ways that are easy to follow and understand, we prepared another little PowerPoint presentation, which we will turn on right now. If you watch our previous video on the Middle East, you will see that we are very critical of Israel's actions in Gaza, and the mainstream media in the United States and the US Congress being unconditionally supportive of Israel, no matter what Israel does. We believe that some distance is necessary and useful for both the United States and Israel. Many have criticized Israel on humanitarian grounds. But we added this novel argument that what's been going on is actually dangerous and bad for Israel in the long run. So the dominant view of the crisis in the Middle East is wrong on two levels: moral grounds, and also from the purely pragmatic point of view with respect to Israel's future. So if you're interested in those arguments, if you want to get that as some additional food for thought, given the crisis that we are facing, that would probably be an interesting video for you to check out. Here, what we want to do is basically engage with this other perspective, which we also call here dissident perspective, that has emerged over the last couple of years, which basically is critical of Israel from different standpoints. It's interesting that this critique of Israel as dominating the US foreign policy is coming both from the left and from the right. The left, that is authentic, genuine left, not the left that's supposedly associated with the Democrat Party, but the genuine, authentic left has long been critical of Israel and Israel's outsized influence on US politics, both through media and the US Congress. So there's nothing new here. It's just nice to see that these voices are becoming stronger and stronger and more numerous. So if you follow, for example, the Gray Zone, the news site, and they have presence on all social platforms. If you follow Glenn Greenwald and System Update, or comedian Jimmy Dore, who also has a very influential presence on various platforms, they've been critical of Israel on humanitarian grounds, and they've been critical of AIPAC's influence in US Congress and on US politics. Interestingly, we see similar movements on the MAGA right, or what you might call MAGA right. People from InfoWars, Steve Bannon's War Room, divergent and novel perspectives on US foreign policy emerging on the right. And again, these could be on different grounds. For example, if you follow Candace Owens, on the web or YouTube and elsewhere, she's critical of Israel on purely moral grounds, much like the authentic left in the United States. If you follow Bannon's War Room or Owen Schroyer from InfoWars, they're more against too deep coupling between the United States and any other country, including Israel, and they also resent any foreign country's influence on the US Congress that's kind of out of the ordinary. In addition to that, many scholars, including the highly respected Professor John Mearsheimer, have documented AIPAC's influence on US politics and are critical of Israel in this regard, similarly with Jeffrey Sachs and so forth. So if you listen to these scholars, which we are big fans of, you will see and hear clear criticisms of AIPAC's influence on US politics. But one kind of implicit or explicit position that accompanies this view is this idea that, yeah, U.S. foreign policy has been hijacked by these Zionist or Israeli lobbies. But ultimately, the interest of the United States is stability in the Middle East and brokering some sort of honest peace deal. What we want to do here is to challenge or enter a conversation with this view from this other perspective, which we call the blob perspective. And this is something that's now increasingly growing on social networks, and many people are kind of coming out with this kind of mindset or proposition that what we are dealing with is not necessarily some kind of mysterious Israeli lobby, but something that's bigger than Israel. This idea of an international or globalist blob that's possibly dictating policies to both the United States and Israel. So Tucker Carlson has this nice label, the blob, which we like. Others talk about the empire. This is more along the lines of what Steve Bannon would say. Oligarchy, something that Jimmy Dore would say, or deep state that many others would say. But there's this thing whose true nature is somewhat murky and unclear. And I'll post a link to another article that was published on my Substack and on Twitter under my name that deals with this interesting question of the nature of the blob and how we should fight it. So I'll post that link in the description to this video. But for now, and for the purpose of this analysis, let's just say that there's this thing, the blob, that's dictating to both the United States and Israel its policies. And the question here is, what if this blob, this entity that's somewhat mysterious, that seems to be dictating policies, not just to the United States and Israel, but also to the European Union and many other countries, what if its interests are not stability and peace in the Middle East, but instead of that, actually conflict? What if this blob wanted conflict all this time? And then we can compare these two perspectives, these two dissident perspectives, based on what we see in the real world. So our contention is that, if anything, new information that came out since our previous video further supports this kind of blob view of what's going on. So here we want to elaborate this blob-based theory of what's been going on in the Middle East so that we can better understand the present and also figure out where things seem to be likely to go in the near future, and what different actors, and especially those interested in peace and justice and interested in the long-term prosperity of the United States and possibly other countries, including Israel and including Arab countries, what they can expect and what political actions they might find most useful when it comes to their own agency. So the information that keeps coming out of USAID and various agencies that are now being taken over by Trump's appointees illustrate the blob's propensity to want to control countries 100%. This has been the case in the Global South for decades now, and the technology of control is pretty clear if you observe what's going on. The interesting thing from the standpoint of American audiences is that this idea of the blob wanting to control societies, it has clearly come back home, and is probably one of the reasons for the big political change in Washington. That is, starting with maybe 10 years ago, many people in the United States started to notice that the country has been run by some other interests and not in their interest. Too many foreign wars, very expensive, too much immigration, and too many benefits being distributed to illegal immigrants at the expense of the native population. So this is something that Tucker Carlson has been vocal about for a while now. But this is something that more and more people noticed, and eventually it resulted in big political changes in the United States and the current president that we have. Also, similar tensions have been observed in the EU and other Western countries. So this entity that's still, as I said earlier, somewhat mysterious, wants total control. And I'll post another link to an article that I published on Substack and Twitter that goes into the question of the blob for whoever wants to follow that. But to limit our discussion to what's been going on overseas in the global south, let's just go over the toolkit that the blob has used to control regimes in the global south, whether monarchies or authoritarian regimes of other kinds. So the basic technology of control of undemocratic regimes across the global south has been blackmail and threats. So how can the blob threaten autocrats across the global south? Well, the blob can basically threaten to support internal opposition in some manner. So most countries have either religious minorities or ethnic minorities, or there's some kind of religious conflict brewing and so forth. So the blob can always tell these dictators and monarchs saying, hey, if you don't behave, you don't do what we want you to do, we'll just support these guys and they will overthrow you at some point. Also, conflicts with neighboring countries. We saw some of that between Kuwait and Iraq in the run-up to the first Iraqi war. There were some oil fields that were shared across the border, and there was some conflict brewing. And it seems that that conflict was used to some extent, provoke a war and everything that followed up. So if you have a neighboring country that's aggressive, has an issue with you, you have a border dispute, the empire can basically tell you, or the blob can tell you, hey, if you don't behave, we are going to side with this other country to grab resources from you or grab territory or whatnot. And the final possible threat is if you don't have any kind of internal or external threats that you can use, maybe you can demonize a regime and threaten them with, destabilize them or threaten them with economic sanctions and negative PR, to the point where you can start threatening them, hey, you're so evil and our public is so up in arms about how evil you are, we may be able to just bomb you and change the regime by force. Another lever of control is that the blob or the empire typically allows and even encourages these autocratic regimes and monarchies to engage in rampant corruption, which is then documented and can be used against the regime via media, PR, and so forth. So you kind of encourage them to steal, and you encourage them to store stolen wealth in Western banks and financial institutions, and then you can threaten to disclose that to the population, make the population angry, or simply cut off their access to their wealth and use that in order to make them behave and do what you want them to do. And the third technology of control is basically infiltration of culture and institutions. As you force the regime to obey and do what you want them to do for you, you also basically gradually force them to allow you access to their institutions throughout society, and then you can increasingly use that to your advantage to control the country deeply, not just the regime, but opposition and culture, celebrities, and so forth. The problem with this technology is that it's not eternal. It has worked really well for a while, starting around the fall of the Berlin Wall. In the unipolar world, in which these regimes had no other power to turn to, this technology of control worked really, really well. Moreover, it worked really well because in the early stages, local populations didn't or were not able to figure out what's going on right at the outset. But over time, it seems that there is some sort of natural fatigue with the blob's control that sets in and makes things increasingly difficult. So if we consider these two one by one, the world is clearly no longer unipolar. So from this standpoint alone, the technology of control of the global south is not as effective as before, because regimes across the global south now have China and Russia as centers of power that they can turn to extract better deals for themselves. BRICS especially, many countries have joined BRICS, and this is not something that Washington likes, because it erodes Washington's ability to control countries across the global south. Also, if you think about some subtle changes in the financial world, globalization, and in addition to the rise of China and Russia, you now have Bitcoin as another viable storage of wealth that these autocratic regimes can use to some extent in a way that's not fully transparent to the blob. And again, that wins them more power vis-a-vis the blob and strengthens their bargaining position. When it comes to the fatigue of local populations with the blob and its rule, it's kind of natural and develops over time. The more the rulers are corrupt and obedient to the blob, the more internal opposition becomes anti-blob. That is, as wide sections of populations notice that the rulers are just following the blob's orders, they instinctively become anti-blob, and pretty soon all potentially viable opposition to the regime becomes explicitly anti-blob. And that's a problem in the long run, especially if the world on top of that becomes multipolar and these populations can turn to alternative centers of power to support them in their efforts to change the policies of the ruling regime. Moreover, the blob has started over the last decade a number of wars and civil wars and cross-border conflicts and so forth. And that's noticed by the world, by peoples and countries across the world. And the credibility of the blob goes down as a result of this. Having seen how many times Kurdish populations in Syria and Iraq and possibly even Turkey were used to advance the blob's agenda, only to be left and be very vulnerable when the blob's agenda changed. People are noticing that and are not as willing as before to basically put all their eggs in one basket and side with the blob in order to achieve their ethnic, political, or religious goals, because the blob has shown to the world that it's not a reliable and faithful partner. It has its own interests and can turn on a dime and leave their prior allies in trouble and very, very, very vulnerable as its interests and tactics around the world change on a day-to-day basis. And then finally, as far as direct interventions, having observed the disasters in Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran's resurgence and the strength of its missile program, populations in the West have become increasingly skeptical as well and less willing to support military interventions. So that's the third lever that the blob can use to blackmail regimes in the global south. And it turns out that what they did to Gaddafi and recently Assad is becoming less and less viable because the entire world and its mood and its reaction to these kinds of actions has been changing in ways that are very, very negative for the blob. Moreover, if you think about the military technology, it seems to have changed. The trouble with the present threat of the Houthis to the very important sea lanes and the blob's inability to secure those sea lanes suggests that the classical navies, aircraft carrier groups, and classical piloted airplanes are becoming more and more vulnerable to new missile technologies. And it seems that this is tilting the power toward populations that control some land mass that can basically present threats to sea lanes and neighboring countries. And these threats cannot be extinguished unless the empire or the blob is willing to go in with boots on the ground and fight an ugly war in order to take control of the land. So it seems that many of the previously dominant war technologies based on sea power and air power are no longer viable, and the modern warfare is increasingly about boots on the ground and very motivated fighting forces, and local populations can seem to have an advantage or kind of are gaining. The power is tilting in their favor, and this is making interventions increasingly risky. And this is something that all empires, not just the blob, but any empire considering a challenge to the blob and establishing its own presence, whether it be China or Russia or anybody else. The fact is that countries and populations that control significant land masses are no longer to be trifled with, no longer to be manipulated as easily as before, because yes, naval power allows you to rain missiles on territories that are relatively far away, but you cannot get too close because you become vulnerable to massive drone or missile attacks. And in order to control land masses, you need boots on the ground. And it's not really clear that there is any other challenger to the blob out there in the real world that's willing to do this and establish new kind of global power that the blob has historically been. And at the same time, the blob's relative power seems to be going down. And this is the reason why we live through such volatile times, because a new world order is being established. The blob is fighting back, trying to restore its influence and dominance across the world, but the technology of doing that is no longer working. And we see this kind of interesting tension in the world in which new powers are up and coming. The blob doesn't want to retreat, but it doesn't make sense to try to reassert itself, given that you no longer have the tools or the ability to reassert your control that you previously had. So we live in very, very interesting and dangerous time as a result of that. So in light of all that, what has been happening in the Middle East? Well, the Middle East is crucial because of its oil, obviously, historically, and the blob's historic fascination and a project that became visible since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and something that was probably natural to try. Once the Berlin Wall fell down, and once the blob was the only power around, it was perhaps natural for the blob to try to dominate the world. And how do you dominate the world? Well, if you could control the Middle East, which the blob had pretty much, except Iraq and Iran, you try to control Iraq and Iran. And if you could control the entire Middle East, including Iran, you basically control the world's energy. If you can supplement that with Russia, if you could turn Russia into a client state, then the last remaining large reserve of oil is under your control, and that's game over for all other countries around the world trying to be sovereign and independent, including India and China. So the blob still seems fixated on this idea, and all the behaviors that we see, whether it's Ukraine or constant angling for a war with Iran, are kind of along these lines. It's clearly not working, but the blob is fixating on this, and we see the change in Washington as a very welcome change that offers this world a chance to peacefully transition into the new multipolar arrangement rather than the blob persistently trying to reassert itself and become the global hegemon, because it's becoming increasingly risky. The blob is behaving increasingly recklessly in this regard, including long-range missiles to Ukraine, including constant attempts to provoke war between Israel and Iran. And the only thing that's missing is that the blob seems unable to establish a coalition of Arab countries willing to join a possible anti-Iran coalition, which is a very welcome development. So the blob is trying, but it's losing control. And rather than being able to get Saudi Arabia and others to join a coalition to fight Iran, it's actually the process is going in the opposite direction. The blob is losing control and the blob is freaking out, and that kind of makes it extra dangerous. So Iraq was an attempt to basically move toward that goal. You take over Iraq, and then you're in a good position to attack Iran, especially given that the US was present in Afghanistan at that time as well. But it just didn't work. And it turned out that Iraq itself backfired in major ways after trillions of dollars spent and thousands of lives of American soldiers lost, and God knows how many local Iraqi lives. Iraq is now basically an ally of Iran, and this is like a major cell phone of the blob. Not a cell phone, but self-own. It was really a horrendously bad move that cost a lot, and basically the outcome was very counterproductive and the opposite of what the blob wanted. Moreover, Egypt and UAE have joined BRICS, which is another very unwelcome development for the blob. This endangers the dollar as the global reserve currency with all its implications. This is potentially very ugly. And to make things worse, Saudi Arabia is also flirting with the BRICS, and this would be another very bad development from the blob. Saudi Arabia, to make things even worse, Saudi Arabia has reestablished diplomatic ties with help from, of all places, China. So this is another slap in the face of the blob. So the blob has been losing across the Middle East. Moreover, if you think about the mood across the Arab world, after Iraq, after Libya, after Gaza, and so forth, regimes and populations are pretty much done with the blob. Color revolutions are no longer an option because there is no force in any Arab country that would be blob friendly, that could potentially be engineered to come to power through some sort of color revolution or anything of similar nature. If you look across the West, the populations are very unhappy with what has been going on. Information again that's been coming out about USAID and so forth. The possibility of another direct military intervention to reassert control of countries in the global South is out of the window at this point. So if you go back to the previous slide, all levers of power that are part of the blob's technology of control of the global South are kind of out of the window or on their way out. So the only viable option that the blob could potentially use to discipline Arab regimes in the Middle East and stop their joining of the BRICS is basically to unleash Israel and make it do something very aggressive, which could destabilize Arab regimes or at least draw them into some kind of insane and counterproductive conflict that would basically limit or hurt the reputation and the credibility of the respective regimes. Arab countries have done this many times in the past, and it seems that they have learned their lesson, and this takes us to basically the current moment. So Arab regimes increasingly disobeying the blob's orders the last desperate move that the blob could make is basically cause major suffering on the West Bank and in Gaza, trying to create waves of refugees, trying to blackmail Arab countries into saying, hey, we are going to stop this only if you stop your process of joining the BRICS and you become more faithful to the blob. That seems to have backfired. This kind of last-ditch desperate attempt to discipline Arab countries has backfired in major ways. And Arab countries seem to have learned their historic lesson, and they have shown remarkable firmness, stability, and restraint regarding Gaza. And this is interestingly across regimes and populations. It seems that the blob was not able to engineer the kind of anger that it wanted and the kind of threats to the stability of Arab regimes as a result. These regimes have basically taken a very principled stand, saying that they're not going to intervene or engage in any ways, but they're not going to accept refugees either, because refugees would destabilize them. But more importantly, accepting refugees would basically allow Israel to get its way. So what we see here is very troubling in the sense that Arab regimes and Palestinians themselves seem to have reached a decision to say, basically, we'll sacrifice as many people as it will take, but this is our line in the sand, and eventually we can start getting some justice and some recourse for our problems that are historic and have been going on for decades. This is also on the rest of the world. The rest of the world has ignored what's been going on in Gaza and the West Bank for decades. It's been a pressure cooker in which the temperature and pressure have been increasing over time, and this was ignored by the entire world. And the entire world needs to face up to this fact. Why was the situation allowed to deteriorate so much as to explode in this way through that horrendous attack on Israel? Some on the left have basically described that as a jailbreak. Think of that whatever you want, but it seems that the world needed to see a massive sacrifice of civilian populations in order to get its act together and start questioning what's been going on and paying attention to what's been going on in Gaza. The interesting outcome of this whole horrendous episode is that this is the first time Israel has lost the PR war with the Arab world and was denied a military victory. Those Hamas fighters seem impossible to root out at the cost that seems acceptable to Israel. And Israel was not able to enter and subjugate Gaza. So it's a horrendous war that maybe a decade ago nobody in this world thought would be possible, this kind of level of civilian casualties and carnage. But here we are, given God knows how many civilian victims. Some are talking even hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who died in order for us to get here where we are. We are facing a situation in which Israel just cannot achieve a military victory. It has lost a great deal of prestige around the world, and something will have to change. And now we have a new administration in Washington, D.C. that may change the nature of the game. And this is actually what caused us to make this video. Syria is another failure of the blob. It's a move that followed after southern Lebanon. Syria was next on the table. And perhaps, or most likely, the plan was to draw Iran into this conflict and get that wish to come true, have a good pretext for war with Iran. But Iran kind of smartly and tactically withdrew from this conflict, denying support to some pro-Iranian factions, basically advising them to not fight. Similarly, Russia has a base in Syria that ended up not being attacked, and perhaps it was a plan of the blob to have Russia suffer a humiliating defeat. But it's interesting what happened. None of that came true, and it could be that the players on the ground, including Turkey and local Islamist and Arab anti-Assad factions, had no appetite in challenging Russia and its military base and incurring casualties in the process. So they kind of let it slide, and now it seems that Russia and the new Syrian government are negotiating. God knows what will come out of that. Perhaps an orderly withdrawal, but the blob didn't get what it wanted, and moreover is now exposed. What came out of this conflict is Arab populations from Morocco to Iraq observing yet another Arab country dismembered. Turkey taking care of its interests and grabbing parts of Syria that it wants to control. Israel doing the same, and now the central government running the show. And the question is, okay, now you guys show us what you can do. And given the players involved, it's not really clear that this will look well. So it's a bad look for the blob, and it's further alienating Arab regimes in the region. And they are already in the process of establishing more independence from the blob, and this is not a good look. So even this attempt to teach a lesson to Arab countries, telling them basically, look, we can dismember you, we can engineer a regime change. It's backfiring in major ways. So where do we go next from here? Now, if you look at the situation, Donald Trump and MAGA are mortal enemies of the blob. Their conflict is primarily internal, inside the United States, dealing with all kinds of nonsense that the blob tried to inflict upon the United States, from various insane woke policies to massive theft and corruption through USAID and elsewhere. Deindustrializing policies and all kinds of corruption and all kinds of things that the population doesn't want. So this kind of oligarchy that's been pursuing its own goals lost in the last election. And now we have Donald Trump and MAGA in charge. And their primary mission is to basically reassert the constitutional order and fight back the blob in the United States. But then also there will be a conflict on the foreign policy front, because Donald Trump and MAGA have this idea of America first and not fighting all these stupid wars and not trying to boss the entire world, even when this costs more than it generates in benefits to the United States. So we can expect some change in foreign policy. And as a consequence, in the Middle East as well. But the question is how big and in which direction. So it's clear what the blob wants, because it just wants a continuation of what it's been doing throughout the years. When it comes to Donald Trump and his administration, interestingly, some of the support of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump himself is fiercely pro-Israel, and some of the supporters are openly Zionist. Yet, if you look at the base of the MAGA movement, many supporters are America first, or isolationist, or simply not interested in foreign policy beyond the point at which the US has clear benefits. So we are going to see three-way tension moving forward between the blob that will push us toward the old way of doing things, MAGA base, and maybe authentic left will join, which will try to pull us toward more isolationism and refusal to engage, especially militarily, overseas. and the Trump administration, which will try to carve its own path, which should be America first. America is a major power in the multipolar world, but not an America that's trying to dominate the entire world, and especially engage militarily when that is very costly with unclear benefits. Many on the left are eager to point out that Donald Trump is just the same as the blob. They're all Zionists. They're all very pro-Israel. They're all very aggressive when it comes to the Middle East. That may appear to be the case, and especially if you look at some important donors to Trump's campaign, that may appear that way. But there is one important fundamental difference in our view. Donald Trump and many in the America First movement, if you look at Steve Bannon, if you look at InfoWars, they are pro-Israel, but in a very different ways from the traditional pro-Israel stance of the blob. This Trumpian support of Israel seems to, at least implicitly, be pro-stability and pro-peace. That is support for Israel and some of its aspirations, but without this idea of Israel that's permanently expansionist and constantly wanting more and constantly being an option to use to destabilize the Middle East in order to control Arab regimes. So there's a fundamental difference here. The blob never wanted Israel at peace with its neighbors because it always wanted this option to activate Israel so that it can blackmail and control Arab regimes. Trump, on the other hand, while supporting some of Israel's aspirations, is not ready to support that idea or even talk about that idea of greater Israel. And there's a fundamental difference here if you consider the Middle East in the long run as a result of these two visions. So the tension between these two will be central moving forward. When you consider MAGA, their priorities are clear. They just want to disengage from everything, and that in a sort of philosophical sense may be viable as a vision of America. It's an option. It's a way of thinking about things. But in reality, the U.S. is a major superpower with huge economic, political, and other interests around the world that will still need defending. So you cannot just say, okay, now we are closing the book and we're going to do something completely different. It's not viable. So when it comes to MAGA and the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, maybe being more reasonable and realistic is likely to be a more productive approach in the long run. So what we are going to see in the medium run, that is in the coming years of this administration. Well, things will be complicated, but some patterns and some central trade-offs are still discernible. We will see 3, 4, 5, or 6-way chess in the Middle East. Going back to our 3 players, the blob will basically continue to use its pawns in the mainstream media and Congress. And moreover, the blob controls Israeli leadership, Netanyahu, and so forth. So they control the state of Israel as of this day. And they will try to use them to extend the current model, constantly agitating for war, constantly preventing stability to take hold, and constantly sabotaging Trump's attempts to broker some sort of lasting peace deal. The irony is that, as we saw previously, this approach is not likely to work. The blob's technology of control is failing, and it's failing more and more on a day-by-day basis. So the more you push in this direction, the more counterproductive this will be in the long run. So in a sense, they want something that they shouldn't want, but they're still aggressively pushing for it because they have no plan B. This is the only game that they're willing to play, and they're just insisting on it. So So they will continue to do this, and in them doing this, they will try to use Zionists and hawks in this administration, which there are probably some present, and they will try to use them as natural allies or what is called useful idiots, and hoping to bridge this gap of 4 years of Trump's presidency so that they can maybe possibly come back after 4 years and continue where they left off, despite the fact that the world seems to be rejecting this paradigm. But this is what they're likely to do. They'll be sabotaging things and trying to agitate for war, including for war with Iran. MAGA base can agitate in the opposite direction, and probably the best course of action for the isolationist or America First MAGA base is to basically monitor Congress and try to primary, take out AIPAC supported warmongers and pressure the administration to limit what it does in the Middle East. I don't think, and none of us here think that Trump is likely to engage the U.S. military in Gaza. That's just not on the table. But every time there is more engagement than the base would like, the base should be vocal about it and grumble, and hopefully that should influence the administration. More important, it will be to basically primary the worst of the warmongers in Congress, people who are supported by AIPAC, people who are hawks, people who are warmongers, because they're likely to be damaging not just with respect to the Middle East and Israel and Gaza, but elsewhere in the world, including Ukraine and possible confrontations with Iran and other places. So this will be the most useful way for the MAGA base to approach this problem. A big unknown will be the authentic, honest anti-war left. These folks have this tendency to automatically equate Trump with the blob, and they are either unwilling or unable to see this kind of this gap between the two and exploit it. So if they could stop themselves from reflexively and automatically sniping at everything MAGA that they see, and try to work together on some issues, that would be of great help. And they can basically do a lot of influence in the information space, on social networks, in the new emerging alternative media, and hopefully, why not in Congress? Help primary warmongers in Congress, including in possibly the Democratic Party, or launching independent candidates to challenge Democrat warmongers where Republicans cannot do it, but there are lots of congressional districts in which there is no reason why a well-organized third party, or maybe through Democratic Party, primary challenges are still possible. But working together with the MAGA right to accomplish the common goal of a more sensible, less aggressive, less jingoist, less militaristic foreign policy. Now, the third and the most important part is Donald Trump and the administration. What kind of middle ground will they occupy here? What kind of course will they take to basically manage the Middle East as they switch to some sort of America First foreign policy? And do hopefully something that the blob never wanted to do: broker a peace between Israel and Arab states, and kind of change the way the US conducts its foreign policy away from that blob-based model of blackmail and threats, and engaging in classical diplomacy, something that the US State Department has probably forgotten about and maybe lost its capability to do classical diplomacy, and engage in that kind of great game with Russian and Chinese diplomats because they had to keep those skills given the position of their countries over the latest decades. They were not in particularly strong positions, so they had to develop diplomacy, and their diplomacies seem to be quite capable, whereas the US diplomacy has become somewhat lazy and corrupted in this process, given the game that it has played over the last 2 decades. So Donald Trump and America First, Secretary Rubio, which has been doing well so far. We were skeptical initially, but he seems to be his heart seems to be at the right place so far. So we are pleased with that. So how will they be able to manage peace in the Middle East and then still keep a sense of presence in the Middle East and engage the United States with Arab countries in constructive ways as the old technology of control goes out of the window? And this is a 6 or 7 or 8 or however many ways game because these three players are internal. That is the blob, MAGA, and the administration. They're US-based, three distinct approaches and interests. But as they engage with the Middle East, they'll have to face a number of foreign partners or adversaries. And if you look around the world, Israel and the EU, which are marked here in red, we mark them in red because they're basically controlled by the blob at this point. So don't expect anything constructive from these guys. This is, of course, not permanent. There are anti-blob forces within Israel and the EU, which should be partners in the long run. But in the short run, Israel and the EU are controlled by the blob, and they will try to sabotage, they will try to provoke conflicts, and they will do anything they can in order to prevent the new foreign policy philosophy take hold in Washington. So they will be the most opposed. Now, if you look at China and Russia, they are global rivals, no matter how you slice it. And it will be interesting to watch how they react to the change in approach in Washington, D.C. So they're facing an interesting trade-off. If the blob continues to do things the way it does, in the long run, that would be lethal to the blob. So in the long run, Russia and China might actually like to see the blob pursue auto-destructive policies so that the blob at some point collapses, and then they can have like a really great opportunity to grab more influence around the world than they would otherwise be able to. However, the problem is in the short run. If the blob is allowed to run the show, the blob is prone to behaving in increasingly risky ways, which might threaten major conflicts, which would not be good for Russia or China. So even though in the long run, Russia and China would be potentially more influential if the blob were allowed to kind of run its course and eventually collapse, the problem is that in the long run, that may entail some really, really dangerous scenarios with missiles and nuclear weapons and God knows what, which are better avoided. So that will likely and hopefully prevent Russia and China from playing this dangerous game and kind of look to tacitly help the new administration by not provoking any trouble that they don't have to provoke. So expect China and Russia to be restrained and allow the administration to fight it out with the blob without much interference, because them interfering would give the blob an excuse and the chance to reassert itself throughout the US foreign policy apparatus and start dictating US foreign policy as well. If they're smart. This will be very, very interesting to watch. And an interesting commentary on the times that we are living is that we are relying on Putin's and Xi Jinping's rationality and restraint in order to help this world through the crisis that it's currently facing, because the prior administration, the EU, and Israel are clearly not helping. Hopefully, Donald Trump, and the first indications are indeed that this is the case, that we are back to a more rational approach that's making big world conflagration and especially the use of nuclear weapons less likely. So this is a good optimistic development for the world. Now, Turkey is in a separate color because it's a NATO country, it's an ally, but it has shown that it's capable of disobeying the blob and basically striking its own tune and melody and pursuing its own interests, whatever those interests may be. So Turkey will be very interesting to watch. It's encouraging that Turkey has smartly avoided conflicts with Russia and conflicts with the blob. The blob has basically drawn a line and not allowed Turkey to deal with the Kurdish part of Syria the way Erdogan and Turkey probably wanted. So Turkey has been assertive, yet it has engaged in very careful managing of trade-offs and tensions in ways to pursue their own interests, but kind of avoid big trouble. So it will be interesting to see how Turkey behaves in this new world and what kind of role America First and Trump envisions for stronger among historical NATO allies, and Turkey is definitely one of them. And then there are Arab regimes and Iran, which are countries that the blob historically wanted to establish control of, and how they will behave in this new environment, and to what extent will they be willing to go the extra mile to be conciliatory and avoid conflict and manage their tensions with Israel in ways that are helpful to the administration. Similarly to Russia and China, they could, in the long run, benefit from the collapse of the blob. But if they support the blob and do things that damage the administration in favor of the blob is likely to basically do some insane things and inflict untold damage on these countries before it collapses anyway. So they're eager to avoid this. So it should be in their interest to support Trump and MAGA, and but on the other hand, the strong Zionist component within the administration may kind of put them in front of some very, very difficult choices if the administration ends up supporting too many of very aggressive agendas of Israel and the Zionists. So to summarize, Zionist expansion and major wars and destruction in the Middle East, in our view, are over or should be over, because the new approach to foreign policy in Washington, D.C. no longer needs an aggressive Israel and is no longer predicated on an Israel that can be unleashed to threaten Arab countries at any moment in time. Now, this raises the question that we somewhat went over in that previous video, is this idea that, were Zionists in Israel useful idiots of the blob over the years? And how rocky will their removal from power be? That is, we still have Netanyahu in power in Israel, a strong Zionist agenda dominating the state of Israel. How will this change in the U.S. Foreign policy affect Israel, and how will that sea change happen in Israel? How peaceful, how rocky will it be? And what will Israel's pursuit of normalcy with its neighbors be like? Here, Trump's negotiating talents and his ability to broker deals may prove to be very, very helpful and useful for the world, Israel, and Arab regimes as well. Now, what concessions will Zionists and MAGA get from the Trump administration, and what will be the Arab and MAGA pushback? That is, if Trump allows or goes with too many concessions to some of his donors and too much being given to Israel, how will Arab regimes and how will MAGA and how will hopefully American left react to that? How explicit, codified, and fast will be the policy shift on Israel when it comes to the United States foreign policy apparatus? And what will the new role of Israel in the Middle East be? These are all open questions. And despite some despair and controversy over Trump's statements about Gaza recently, it seems that they're like intentionally somewhat outlandish, but they establish one clear line. Trump is pretty clear about not giving Gaza to Israel, and this is a denial of a major maximalist Zionist goal. So those on the left who are just eager to snipe at MAGA and be very, very critical of Trump automatically without even thinking about it, it's useful to kind of step back and think about the bigger game that's going on here. The statements are probably outlandish on purpose, but the important clear red line is that Israel is not getting in complete control of Gaza, and this idea of ethnically cleansing Gaza of all of its population. That's clearly not going to happen. Now, that's not something that many on the American left would like and think is nearly enough, but it is something. And politics is art of the possible. And many on the American left seem unable to kind of grasp that concept. They're constantly reaching for a very strong condemnation of Israel and rollback of everything. And that's just not how the world works. Israel is there. It will not be thrown into the sea as some dream of. And if anything, being too vocal about it is only strengthening Israel's position and resolve to fight back and get more rather than less, or agree to getting less rather than more. So this is something to keep in mind. In a broader sense, America first needs a new doctrine for dealing with the multipolar world that's emerging. The old technology of control is failing anyways. This is something that we argued here on slide number 3, I believe. And but the United States still has huge economic, security, political, and all kinds of other interests around the world to defend. And this will have to happen. And the big challenge for Rubio and Trump is how to reorient the vast foreign policy apparatus, how to design a substitute to US aid who could help accomplish these goals in a different way from what US aid used to do in order to retain influence. And we'll devote a follow-up video to this question. We'll just leave you with the thought that the world actually needs the United States. The world may not realize that, but having another polar center of power in North America, and especially given the US Constitution and the United States' unique position in the world, despite all the evil and bad things that the blob has done over the years, many on the left, especially being aware of the kinds of things that the blob has done in South America and across the global South, the reflexive position is, okay, this needs to go away. The faster it goes away, the better for the entire world. Well, that kind of thinking is too linear. The fact that one empire did bad things doesn't mean that potential alternatives would not have been even worse. So those who focus on China building ports across Africa and infrastructure across the global south, maybe things are not that straightforward, and maybe a China-dominated world would look way worse than the blob-dominated world, with all the evil and all the problems that the blob has done. Now, especially if the United States changes internally and reasserts its constitutional order, it as a center of power may have very, very positive impact on the world, and very positive role in the world, which should not be discounted. This is something that the world should want, and we need a good, open, creative conversation about what America First foreign policy should look like and how it could possibly be implemented. Now, as we move forward and as this process, which will have to be gradual, takes place, what happens with Israel, Iran, and Ukraine will be a major indicator of where the U.S. Foreign policy is going, what the vision of Trump and Rubio is. So stay tuned, and we'll address some of these questions in future videos. But this is our view where things are going. And the major takeaway here is that we have three players internally, and to draw a distinction between the blob and what has been and what's about to take place. This idea that America First and Trump's administration are not the same, and there will be a change. And given that there will be a change, all players should seek place at the table and have some capacity to move things in directions that they consider desirable, favorable, or just.